The Hidden Holocaust, a genocide nearly twice to 3 times the size of Hitler's campaign to exterminate the Jews. Belgium's King Leopold II was responsible for the death of 10 to 15 million people from 1885 to 1908 in what is today known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you missed it, that's 10 to 15 million people. That's like wiping out the entire population of New York City, Cairo, Sweden, or Belgium itself. This is the story of how Leopold's regime colonized, exploited, murdered, enslaved, and maimed the people of the Congo, and how Brussels' dark colonial past is catching up to it today. When King Leopold II was born in 1835, Belgium was only 5 years old. He was the eldest surviving son of Leopold I. Most of the royal families of the time in Europe were actually related. For example, Leopold II was the first cousin of Queen Victoria of Britain. Leopold inherited the throne of Belgium when his father died in 1865. But by the late 19th century, most of these royals had ceded power to parliaments and cabinets that yielded the real political power, as was the case in Belgium. There is really nothing left for us kings except money, were the words of Leopold to German Emperor William II while watching a parade in Berlin. And so, obsessed with acquiring more wealth, frustrated over Belgium's small size and stature, and keen on establishing his country as a colonial power, Leopold decided to join the European colonization of Africa. In his own words, quoted by US historian Hochschild in his book King Leopold's Ghost, Leopold said, quote, "A fine chance to secure for ourselves a slice of this magnificent African cake." And the scramble for Africa was moving fast. To put it in perspective, in 1870, more than 80% of sub-Saharan Africa was under the rule of indigenous chiefs and kings. 40 years later, all of it, apart from Ethiopia and Liberia, were colonized by white settlers. Colonization was an unattainable extravagance for a Belgian government which did not possess a navy or even merchant marines. But Leopold had his own Machiavellian plans for Africa. He hired the explorer Henry Morton Stanley to travel up and down the vast Congo River basin, setting up trading posts, building roads, and persuading local chiefs to sign treaties with Leopold. Back in Europe, Leopold cast himself as a philanthropist, willing to spread the benefits of Christianity and Western civilization to African natives, opening up the path for civilization in the only part of our world that it still hasn't reached, piercing the darkness in which entire populations are shrouded, is, I dare say, a crusade worthy of this era of progress. This is part of Leopold's speech during the Berlin Conference in 1885, a racist and misguided civilizing mission narrative, enough to convince the US and other Western European powers to recognize a huge swath of Central Africa, around 2 million square kilometers, 60 times the size of Belgium, as King Leopold's personal property. It was the world's first private colony, and Leopold called it État indépendant du Congo, the Congo Free State. Ironically, he had more power over this area than he did his own country. Leopold never visited the Congo, but it became a major source of his wealth. Initially, Leopold was interested in ivory, a material greatly valued before the appearance of plastics. As the rise of the automobile industry arrived, rubber became essential. A big source of wild rubber was the Landolphia vines in the great Central African rainforest. Leopold paid for the formation of a local private army. The 19,000-man-strong Force Publique was tasked with exploiting the much-needed rubber. During this period, the brutality of Leopold's men was unparalleled. Women were held hostage and men sent to collect rubber. The women were raped. The men who were unable to find enough rubber or tried to defy colonials were killed. An infamous practice that became widespread during this period was maiming or chopping off the hands and feet of Congolese children, women, and men. Photos of the time clearly depict the horrific reality. The reasons behind it was as morally void as the practice. For each bullet used, a soldier of the Force Publique had to present his white officer the severed hand of a rebel killed. Maiming was also used as a punishment against locals for not fulfilling the rubber production quotas. To make up for the low production, troops actually began to use hands as currency. US author Pete Forbath in his book The River Congo described these horrific conditions as, quote, "The baskets of severed hands set down at the feet of the European post commanders became the symbol of the Congo Free State." He went on to say, quote, "Collecting hands became an end in itself. Soldiers of the Force Publique brought the hands to the stations instead of rubber." Colonial administrators also kidnapped orphan children from communities and transported them to child colonies to work or train as soldiers. Estimates suggest that 50% of these children died. The focus on rubber had other disastrous consequences, as no able-bodied men were left to hunt, fish, or cultivate crops, and so famine and disease killed off even more of the native population. Millions were dying, the birth rate was dropping, and the trauma was widespread. Meanwhile, Leopold was busy building human zoos, such as the African Museum in his palace at Tervuren, which featured 267 Congolese people as exhibits. This cruelty, racism and barbarity is seen by some as the first genocide of modern times. Demographers estimate that between 1880 and 1920, the population of the Congo was slashed by half, from 20 million people at the beginning of that period to an estimated 10 million at the end. Those who had set out on a civilizing mission had acted in a truly uncivilized manner. Despite the rest of European colonization and exploitation campaigns across the continent, it got so bad in the Congo that international pressure mounted against Belgium and its king. European writers and leaders condemned and exposed Leopold's regime. First, it was British journalist Edmund Dean Morrow. Joseph Conrad, Arthur Conan Doyle and Mark Twain also joined the cause, and the sad reality of the Congo began to spread through their literature. Belgian Parliament eventually forced Leopold to relinquish control of his fiefdom in 1908, a year before he died. The transition wasn't cheap though. Leopold only relinquished his control after a financial compensation of 250 million Belgian francs, approximately more than $2 billion in present-day currency. Belgian Congo remained a colony until 1960 and the emergence of anti-imperial heroes like Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. But Belgium from 1908 to the 1960s continued many of Leopold's racist policies, such as segregation between the natives and white settlers, maintaining very harsh work conditions for the locals used to exploit minerals, and the mass kidnapping of thousands of mixed-race children known as Métis from Burundi, DR Congo and Rwanda in the 1940s and 50s. The scars of colonization have still not healed, and Leopold's controversial legacy in the Congo still haunts his country today. At the end of his days, Leopold had become very unpopular, not so much for his actions in the Congo, but rather his personal life. His inability to speak proper Dutch, his estrangement from his daughters, and fetish for teenage prostitutes was enough to discredit his name. However, as World War I threatened the very existence of Belgium, the fortifications Leopold advocated for in the eastern part of the country had slowed German troops down, and the wealth accumulated in the Congo had increased the stature and development of the small European nation. And so Leopold's nephew Albert erected statues of his uncle all over the country. And for years the result has been a glorified collective amnesia of Belgium's atrocities in Central Africa. Today, Belgium has yet to issue a formal apology or reparations to the DRC. Marking 60 years of DRC independence, a letter expressing regret for crimes of the past by the Belgian King Philippe was sent to the Congolese president. A first for any Belgian monarch and a reflection of the pressure mounting on Belgium to deal with its dark past. Impacted by the global rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, protesters in Belgium vandalized, burnt and took down King Leopold's statues all over the country. In addition to calling for well-thought and rounded reparations to the Congo, Africans are still systematically excluded from employment, education and opportunity, not only in Belgium, but across Europe and North America. Meanwhile, the DRC ranks at 176th place in the Development Index from 189 countries, and Belgium sits happily in 17th place, not to mention acting as the de facto capital of the European Union. The point is, if it weren't for colonization and the brutality and violence exported to Africa, the scenario could have been very different for a conflict-ridden poor country like the DRC. The question is, will those who came out on top admit, pay and apologize for what they did?